So what do we have to know here in order to introduce Daf Nun Gimel? We have to know about a statement of Rabbi Yehuda, and the cases where a Kohen was Makadish and Isha with his chelik in the carbon, meaning, let's say you have a carbon which is the meat of which is divvied up amongst the Kohanim, and each Kohen will get a share in the carbon, and he takes his share and he is Makadish and Isha with it. And Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion, as quoted in the Brisa, that the Kiddushin is valid, Mekudeshes. Rabbi Yossi disagrees, and he says that it's Mishulchan Gavoa Kazochu, that the Kohen doesn't really own his chelik in the basar carbon. The Torah just gives him a mitzvah to eat it, but he doesn't own it. He's not the bailam, therefore he cannot be Makadish and Isha with it. And the question is, did Rabbi Yehuda maintain that position for the balance of his life? And here we have machlokes. Rabbi Yochanan insists that Rabbi Yehuda at some point rescinded his view, and he accepted the view of the Chachamim and of Rabbi Yossi that Eina Mekudeshes, that the Basar Kodesh is Mishulchan Gavoa, he doesn't have bailus. It's not his personal ownership. V'Rav Amar Adayin hi machlokes. So here on the top of Daf Nun Gimel, on the second line, you'll see Rav insists that Rabbi Yehuda never changed his mind. He never rescinded his original position, and he still insisted that the Kiddushin is valid and that the Kohen is Zocha in his Chelek, and he has bailus, personal, private ownership in the Chelek that is divvied up, and he got that Chelek in the Kiddushin. And the Gemara now is going to bring a proof to support Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Yehuda eventually rescinded his position, and he conceded to the Shita, the Chachamim, and Rabbi Yossi that he doesn't have bailus over his Chelek in the carbon. Now, by way of introduction to a very long brisa, which is really based on a sifra, and that's important because, as we'll soon see, Rabbi Yehuda was the author of the sifra. The Pasuk says in Vayikra Perek Zayin, Kol mincha sher te'ofe b'tanur v'chol nasa b'marcheshes v'al machvas la'kohen ha'makriv oso lo siyah v'chol mincha blula v'ashemen v'charevo l'chol b'nei Aaron tia ish ke'achiv. So if we read the Pasuk carefully, the Pasuk, we'll see the difference between marcheshes and machvas in a minute. But v'chol mincha, it says, la kohen hamakriv osa lo siyah, which means that the implication, lo siyah, is that enochinami, the mincha belongs to the kohen. He is the kohen hamakriv and lo siyah. However, at the end of the pasuk, it says, L'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh. And that implies that somehow there's like a communal ownership over the kodshim, and it's not specifically in the possession of one kohen. So the question is, how do we reconcile the ratio of the pasuk, which says lo siyeh, implying private ownership, as opposed to l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh at the end of the pasuk, which implies that it's divvied up amongst the Beis Av of the Kohanim of that day, and it doesn't belong to any particular Kohen. Now, the pasuk opens, as we said before, with the phrase "v'chol mincha," l'chol b'nei Aaron tia, which implies that from any mincha, you give a chelek to each Kohen, lo sia. And the Sifra, which we're going to quote now, is going to clarify the Seder Hadrosha Shal Psukim. How do we darshan these psukim? Amar Abaye, Kavasei Rabbi Yochanan Mistav. Rabbi Yehuda retracted his original position, and there's no private ownership over Kodesh, and therefore the Kiddushin is not valid if he gives her his chelik in the Kodesh. This Sanya we learned in the Brayso Minayin Shein Cholkim Menachos Keneged Zvachim. What happens if you have one Kohen who is doing the avoda in Zvachim, meaning in Behemos, and you have another Kohen who's doing the avoda in Menachos? And one Kohen turns to the other and he says to him, look, you take my chelik in the mincha and its equivalent value in the zevach, I will take. Let's make a swap. So for example, in basar, chatos, and asham, you have what's called chazeh v'shok. No, I'm sorry. Just 1 second. Okay, I'm pretty sure that chazeh v'shok is relevant to shlomim. Anyway, in basar, in chatos v'yasham. So again, you'll take my chelik in the mincha. I'll take the equivalent value on the market in basar, chatos v'yasham. And the pasuk is going to exclude such a barter deal. Such an exchange is disqualified. Talmud lomer v'chol mincha sher teyafer b'tanur l'chol b'nei Aaron tia. And the implication is that every mincha unto itself has to be divvied up and given to one of the b'nei Aaron. Yochel, I might think, lo yechalku minachos keneged zvachim. There's a logical reason why you can't cross, cross-pollinate between a mincha and a zevach. For example, let's say you have what's called a carbon olav yored. And it all depends upon what your financial status is, and that's going to determine what the kapara of the carbon is. The Torah says, Shalo kamu tachteim b'dalus. The menachos cannot substitute, or in this case be exchanged, for zvachim. So tachteim means to be exchanged. And what does b'dalus mean? Let's say the chote is very, very poor. He cannot bring a zevach, so instead he brings an oaf. And that oaf is a replacement, or shall we say a substitute, for the behemoth of the zevach. And this is based on a pasuk in Vayikra Perkei, Vim lo sagia yado deiseh, vehevi shtei torim o shnei b'nei Yona echad l'chatas v'echad l'yolo. And that's called the carbon olav yored. And that's if he brings shnei b'nei Yona or shtei torim, then that's considered a dalus, a carbon of dalus. And the carbon of dalus, as we said before, is made up of shtei torim or shnei b'nei Yona, meaning ophos. So you cannot substitute or swap an oaf for a zevach, even though the oaf is coming from the same chote and the same mechape, but nevertheless, it's dalus. And not only that, but not mina menachos, if you have what's called dale dalus, he can't even afford an oaf, then he brings a karban mincha, which is made of soles, and the Torah says, "V'im lo tasig yado l'shtei torim el shnei b'nayov he'vias karbono asher chata asiris ha'efos soles l'chatos." So what's going on here is basically the mincha, in the case of Dali Dalus of a Chote, is a totally different category than Zevach. And therefore the din is that you cannot swap a mincha for a Zevach. Avol yecholku, I might have a Havamim, that they could divide up minachos keneged ophos, because ophos is already a karban dalus. And if the mincha is a minchas chote, which is again dale dalus, maybe you could switch, you could make a barter exchange, a swap between minachos and ophos. Sharei kamu tachteim b'dalus, because the ophos are, in the case of dalus, a substitute for basar zevach. Talmud lomar v'chol nase b'marcheshes l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyah. And the question here, implicit in this brisa, which, as we said before, is a sifra, is why did the Torah have to specify the marcheshes? Why didn't it just say stam? Kol mincha l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyah. So therefore, the extra word marcheshes is coming to teach me that even minchos keneged ophos, we don't recognize and allow a chalukah. Yachol, but I might think, lo yecholku minachos keneged ophos. Okay, fine. Halolu minei daviv, halolu minei kmachim. Perhaps even the karban dalus of ophos is fundamentally and categorically different than minachos. Minachos is made of kemach, whereas ophos is min damim. I mean, they do the mitzvah adam on the mizbeach. Whereas you're talking about the mincha that's made of soles, that's a whole different category. So the Torah was makbid that you cannot switch one from the other. Avol yechalku ophos keneged zvachim, shalolu v'halolu minei damim. Perhaps the Kohanim could make a swap of ophos, which is also min damim, keneged zvachim, and vice versa, because they're all categorically the same minei damim. Talmud lomar, we go back to the pasuk that we started with, and again there are two extra redundant words, v'al machmas. And the Torah could have just said v'chol mincha l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyah. Kol mincha would include not only marcheshes but also machmas. So it means that the extra word machmas is a miut to exclude ophos keneged zvachim. Yochel, I might think yolechalku ophos keneged zvachim shalolu ma'aseihem biyad v'halolu ma'aseihem b'kli. In the case of zvachim, I need shchita. In the case of ophos, all I need is malika. That's called a ma'aseh yad, because the malika is implemented through tzipor and yado, whereas vachim requires a kli, something very sharp, whether it's a knife or something else. Okay, fine. So there's a fundamental difference in kodshim, in the avodas hakar between ophos and zvachim. You can't swap the two. But avol, I might have a havamina yechalku minachos keneged minachos. What if you have a minchas machvas and you want to swap it with another kohen who's bringing a minchas marcheshes? Halolu v'halolu b'maseim v'yad. Yad here doesn't mean malika. There's no malika in minachos, but rather it means kmitza, and they both require kmitza. The difference is, in the shemen itself, whether it's if it's a thick batter or it's a thin batter. Talmud Lomar, v'chol mincha blula v'shemen l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh. This detail of v'chol mincha blula v'shemen is also redundant, and therefore it must be coming to be mamayit something, to exclude something, and that is shelo yachlifu mincha of one min with mincha of another min, namely machvas and marcheshes. Yochalam, I think, lo yecholku machvas keneged marcheshes. And why is that so in this Havamina? Because machvas is a very wide, low kli. It hardly has a base kibul. It's not really a receptacle. It's almost like a flat pan. And that's used for the baking of the menachos on the Eish. That's called a minchas machvas. But marcheshes is a whole different story. It's done inside of marcheshes, which is a utensil that's used for baking menachos. And even though they put it on the Eish afterwards, but it has a base kibul. And if I remember correctly, it has a softer kind of a dough. Or the opposite, flip it over the other way, marcheshes kineged machvas. And that's because Zoma Seim Rakim. Here he specifies which one is the softer one. And that's the one that's marcheshes. So the mincha that's prepared in a marcheshes comes out miru kakos, which I believe means soft, rakim. Vizo, but now we have the machvas. Right? The machvas we said was like a flat pan. And when you do a mincha in a flat pan, it comes out koshos. Very hard. So since the method by which these two menachos, whether it's marcheshes or machvas, are prepared are so radically different, the Torah was makbid that you can't swap one for the other. Well, yechalku machvas keneged machvas, marcheshes keneged marcheshes. Now, I'm not exactly sure why Reuven wants to swap his machvas with Shimon's machvas, or his marcheshes with Shimon's marcheshes. That I don't know why. Shalolu v'alolu masem kosher, but both of them, in the case of, let's say, machvas. Let's say we said machvas was kosher, right? Masem kosher. Inam masem rakim in the case of marcheshes. Talmud lomar, and that's why the Torah went out of its way to say v'chol mincha v'lulav hashemen v'chareva l'chol bnei Aaron tiyeh. And the word v'chareva is redundant, and therefore comes as a mute that you can't even swap mincha keneged mincha, even if the Masechet shteim shava, they're both machvas, they're both marcheshes. Yochalim, I think, lo yechalku bekodesh hakadoshim. So if you want to swap a chatos keneged chatos, an osham keneged osham, a mincha keneged mincha, these are all kodshei kodshim. Aval yicholku bekodshim kalim. Let's say, for example, you're a Kohen and you are being makriv a korban toda. I'm a Kohen and I'm being makriv a korban shlomim. Or let's say we're both being makriv shlomim. The Torah didn't say anywhere or indicate that it's an isur achlofa, except in the case of mincha, which is kodesh kadoshim. How do you know that the isur achlofa includes even kodshim kalim? Talmud lomar, it says l'chol bnei Aaron tiyeh ish ke'achiv v'samechle, and immediately afterwards it says zos Torah zevach hashlomim im al todo yakrivenu, and it comes to teach us kishem shein cholkim v'kodshei kodshim kach ein cholkim v'kodshim kalim. From the smichus of kodshei kodshim to kodshim kalim, right? Because it says Zos Torah Zevach Hashlomim Im Al Toda Yakrivenu. So Shlomim and Toda are both Kodshim Kalim, but since the Torah was masmich that to the case of a mincha, which is Kodshim Kodshim, it comes to teach me that the Isur Chalukah applies in Kodshim Kalim to the same extent that it applies in Kodshe Kodshim. Okay, now the end of this brisa is already the Gemara quotes it here, but it's already a digression here, because the pasuk ends with Ish ke'achiv. Right? It says L'chol b'nei Aaron tia Ish ke'achiv. So what's Ish ke'achiv? Ish cholek afilu balmum v'ein cotton cholek afilu tam. So even a Baal Mum who cannot do the Avodas HaKarban, nevertheless, he's cholik, meaning he gets a chelik in the carbon. And the Gemara in Zvachim on Daf Tzadi Tes derives the halacha that there's achilas balmum bekodshim from the pasuk called Zachar bekarnim yocha. Fine. But a katan is excluded on the word ish. He cannot receive a chelek in the carbon, even if he's a tam. He's not even a balmum, but he's not considered ish. Fine. Now we swing back to try to prove Rabbi Yochanan, namely that Rabbi Yehuda was choser bo, and Lamaskana, Rabbi Yehuda concedes to Rabbi Yossi that you cannot be Makadish and Isha with your chelik in the carbon. Stam Sifra, Rabbi Yehuda, a Torah's Kohanim, is a brisa that even if there's no name mentioned, implicitly, it is authored in a tribute to Rabbi Yehuda. So this brisa of the Sifra is Rabbi Yehuda. Vehu ka'amar, and yet he himself says, the less ba din chalukah klal. There's no such thing as chaluk in a carbon. Shmamina. Why isn't there any chaluk in a carbon? And no Kohen can give his chelik, can get another chelik of another coin in another carbon. It must be because he has no bailus and he has no mama. Is memela the same thing is going to apply if he tries to give his chelik to a woman? It's not your carbon. You don't own that chelik in the carbon. It's not your mama, and therefore you cannot be mekadosh it. And we conclude from here that Rabbi Yehuda was choser bo, and he comes to the final conclusion and accepts the position and the ruling of Rabbi Yossi that a makadosh bechelko ain't a mekudeshes, as we saw in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And Rava now wants to bring a proof to support Rav that Rabbi Yehuda was not choser bo. Amar Rava ukirav milotanya. We have a brisa that supports Rav and proves that Rabbi Yehuda did not rescind his original position, and he holds that Kodshim is Moment Bailim, and she's Mekudeshes. Vasanya, we learned in the Brisa with regard to Lechem Aponim. Now, after Shimon HaTzadik died, is Nishlacha Me'era V'Lechem Aponim. And the Lechem Aponim, each coin got such a small piece, Kipul Alovan, it wasn't Masbiach. And it's less than a kizayis. Hatznuim, Moshchim, Es Yedem. The Tznuim didn't want to take any chelik in the Lechem Aponim. Why? Because it's not going to give them svius, and it's less than a kizayis. It's not a mitzvah of sachila. So let the Gargonim eat it. So the Gargaronim, those were the people who had a taiva to eat, and Cholkim. And the Gemara thinks Cholkim means that the Chelik HaTznuim, which was not picked up and taken by the Tznuim because they were Moshe Yedeim, then the Gargaronim, they would take the Chelik Hatznuim and they would be Cholkim. They would sort of give it out and share it. So we see that this Tana holds is a din of Chalukah in Monos. And we have to derive the conclusion of Mammon Bailim, meaning Mammon Kohanim. And we don't know anyone who holds such a position except for Rabbi Yehuda, so we must assume that this brisa reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. And the machloka still goes on. Says you were a knave. You didn't understand the brisa. My cholkim, what does the brisa mean when it says cholkim? And that means the Gargaronim came to take a chelik in the lechem aponim when it was so little, and cholkim means chotfim. They would grab onto whatever they could get from the lechem aponim, and there was no agreement or kinyan through which they had rights to take it. But you can't prove anything here about Rabbi Yehuda insisting on his shita, because the word cholkim doesn't mean that they're machalik to kodshim with achlafa mizeh mizeh. And I'll prove it to you. Kediktani seifa. The end of this brisa says, Maisa bi echad, one of the Garonim. Chataf. Here it doesn't say cholak, but chataf. Chelko v'chelek chavero. He grabbed not only the portion that was coming to him, the lechem aponim, but also he grabbed onto a portion from some other kohen. Well, you kohen also ben chamtzon. And Gemara is going to try to figure out what the word chamtzon means. And a malach. But basically it means ish chamtzon. Chamtzon. Ad yom mosa. They called him by that name until he died. In any event, we see that cholkim means chatifa, that he grabbed something, chotfin. But it has nothing to do with chalukas hakarbon. And how do we know that a chamson is a chamson? Amar Rabba bar Shilo, Maikra. So we have Rabba bar Shilo, and then we have Rabba himself. Maikra, what's the pasuk in Tillim? It says, Elokai palteni miyad rosha mikaf ma'avil l'chometz. L'chometz. David HaMelech is mispal to Hashem that he should save him from those who do avel and chometz. And it uses the word chometz. Rabba Omar mehacha from a pasuk in the beginning of Sefer Yeshaya, limdu heitev dirshu mishpat ishru chamotz. You should learn to improve heitev, to improve your actions, and you should be choker the mishpat to see who is the tzaddik, and to chazku es hanigzal, give strength to the victim of Zela and encourage him to go ahead and reclaim that which is legally his. And we see here that chamotz is a reference to Geza. Now the Mishnah records a machlok shin Rab Meir Rab Yehuda regarding Ma'aser Sheni. Can you be Makadosh and Ishu with Ma'aser Sheni? According to Rab Meir B'Shog Me'aser Lo Kidesh, because Rab Meir holds that Ma'aser Sheni is Mama Gavoah, it doesn't belong to you, don't have personal private ownership. Rab Yehuda Omer B'Shogeg Lo Kidesh, but B'Mezid Kidesh. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that if he made a mistake about it, so it's basically Kiddushin Tos, he never really intended to give her Ma'aser Sheni, she didn't intend to accept Ma'aser Sheni, but if it was Mezid, Kiddush. Because there's no Tos, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that Ma'aser Sheni is Mammon Bailim. Minani, from whence did Rabbi Meir derive that Ma'aser Sheni is Mammon Gavoah, and therefore he cannot be Makadosh and Isha under any circumstances with Ma'aser Sheni? Amarav Acha, Braid the Rav Mishmei the Gemara. He says this is Kavua v'Shogrim Mipi Talmudei Beis HaMedrash. The pasuk says v'Chol Maaser Haaretz, and the Torah is referring to Ma'aser Sheni in Vayikra Perek of Zayin. And it says, V'chol maser ha'oretz asher tafrish mizera ha'oretz. That means Dagon. Mi priya eitz, that means Tirosh v'yitzar. Lashem hu kodesh Lashem. Lashem hu v'lo l'kadish bo'os ha'isha. So the Ma'aser Sheni really belongs to Hashem. With Zoche, that Hashem gives from His Shulchan to us. We bring the Ma'aser Sheni to Yerushalayim, we eat it in Yerushalayim. But it wasn't given to man to be Mekadosh and Isha. And that's basically Mammon Gavoah. And that is the Shita Rabbi Meir. The Gemara asks, wait a second. Harei Trumas Maser, right? The Levi is Mafresh Truma Min Maser. The Chsiv in Bamidbar Yudches, I believe it's Parshas Shlach. Kain Torimagam Atem Trumas Hashem Mikol Masro Seichem. So it says in the pasuk Trumas Hashem Usnan. And yet we learned in a Mishnah later on Daf Nun Ches here in Masechet Kiddushin, Hamakadish B'Truma, which means Truma Gedola, Trumas Maser, Mekudeshes. So you see, despite the fact that it says Lashem, you could still use the Truma to be Mekadosh and Isha. In Truma Gedola and Trumas Maser. Our answer is no. We will not derive the conclusion of Mammon Gavoah Delo Ksiv Bei Lashem. It doesn't say in Ma'aser Sheni Lashem. And the pasuk Lashem is referring to Truma. Just one second, I got this. All right. So again, Lo Ksiv Bei in Truma. We said a Makadosh B'Truma Kudeshet. It doesn't say in Truma, like it says in Ma'aser Sheni, Lashem. So therefore, Rabbi Meir will disqualify Kiddushin with Ma'aser Sheni, Baby Mezer, Baby Shogeg, that's Rabbi Meir, but not in Truma. Correct the Gemara Varei Chala. We see the language of Lashem in Chala. The Chsiv Ba over there in Bamidbar Tesvav, it says Mereish Zarisosedim Titnu Lashem Truma. So therefore, according to your logic, Lashem means that it's Mammon Gavoah, and you can't be Mekadosh and Isha. And yet Utnan, we have a Mishnah that states, and again, this Mishnah is going to come out later on in Daf Nun Ches, Hamakadesh B'Trumos. And what does Trumos mean? Not just Truma Gedola, but also Chala, which is also called Truma, Mekudeshes. And a person has the rights to give his Truma to any Kohen that he wants to, and that's called Tovas Hano. You can be Mekadosh and Isha with Tovas Hano. And even though it says Lashem, the Kiddushin is valid. So why do you tell me, according to Rabbi Meir, that if he's Mekadosh b'Ma'aser Sheni, Eina Mekudeshes, because the pasuk in Ma'aser Sheni says Lashem. Here also in Chala it says Lashem. Titnu Lashem. And the Gemara answers, Lo Ksiv Bei Kodesh. In the case of Ma'aser Sheni, the pasuk says Kodesh Lashem. Not so in the case of Truma and Chal. There it says Lashem, but it doesn't say Kodesh Lashem. In fact, the Gemara Varei Shvius, Perish Shvius, it says Kodesh. The Ksiv Bei in Vayikra Chafei Parshas Bahar, it says regarding Shvius, Yovel Hi Kodesh Tieh Lachem, and Shvius has the same status as Yovel in terms of its Kedusha. So Kodesh Tieh Lachem applies and is Ola even on Shvius, Utnan, and yet we said a Mekadosh Perish Shvius, Mekudeshes. Yeah, okay, I don't know why the Gemara is raising this question. Again, it says Kodesh, but it doesn't say Lashem. That's the Gemara is going to answer now. To Lo Ksiv Bei Kodesh Lashem. It only says Kodesh. When it says Kodesh Lashem, like in the case of Masechet, Rabbi Meir insists that's Mama Gavah. But in the case of a Kaddish B'Peira Shvius, the Kiddushin is valid because the Torah says Kodesh, but not Kodesh Lashem. Frek the Gemara Varei Truma Dichsiv Kodesh Yisrael Lashem Reishis Tvuasa. Yisrael Kodesh Lashem like Reishis Tvua. And that's the Truma that's called Reishis. Utanana Makadish B'Truma Mekudeshes. So why don't you take the words Kodesh Lashem in Truma and derive from it that Truma is Mama Gavah? And the Gemara answers, Hahu B'Yisrael Ksiv. That pasuk is talking about the Shvach of Yisrael. They are considered Kodesh Lashem like Truma. But we're not talking about Truma itself. And the Gemara here, which Mirz Hashem will look at tomorrow on the top of the Gimel Amid Beis, rejects this answer that the pasuk is talking about Shevach Yisrael, because V'lav Memela Shamet Minei. That this Shevach is even on Truma. Now I'm finishing off. And this Shevach is even on Truma. That Truma is like Yisrael, and it's Kodesh Lashem. And therefore, if Truma is Kodesh Hashem, then according to Rabbi Meir, it should be Mama Gavah, and you can't be Mekadosh and Isha with it. And therefore, the Gemara answers, Tirguma Ravin Saba Kami the Rav, Omar Kra, the pasuk says Lashem who? And what does the extra word who mean? Behavi also. The Meiser Atzmo is Lashem Yehei, and that makes it into Mama Gavah. But that's only as far as Masechet is concerned. With regard to Truma, it doesn't have the extra word who. It just says Kodesh, Kodesh Lashem. Okay, then. So this is where we'll stop, and Mirz Hashem will. It was very good to get this in, for 40 minutes, because, as you see, there's a lot of coaching here. All right, then, Chag Sameach. Thank you so much.